some stragglers who are going to come in, but the challenge with running any event like this is the networking is amazing, but we still have to get through the full agenda. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this meeting. These meetings wouldn't be successful if it weren't for the participation of the attendees, quite frankly. So I think you should all give yourselves a hand for coming to these things. Our next panel is going to be moderated by the chair of Life Sciences Ontario, Paul Lucas. Paul is known to many of you, I'm sure, in the audience. Comes from leadership positions within the pharmaceutical business and has done a tremendous job taking the reins of Life Sciences Ontario. So Paul, if you'd like to come up and lead the panel.
Thanks, John. Maybe I can ask our panelists to come on up and take a seat, and I'll join you there in a minute. About? Oh, yeah. Yeah. So just remember the agenda does have hashtags against each of the panelists, so you can tweet if you desire. So welcome to our next session, and this, of course, is on the role of industry associations in the Ontario Life Sciences Cluster. I found this morning very interesting. I take myself back 20 years and listening to Peter talk about Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. It was about 20 years ago when I was at GSK. I thought, you know, this province really needs a focus on life sciences. And, you know, back then it was all about cars, and it was about forestry, and it was about other resources and the financial sector. Sounds a little bit familiar. RIM was starting to emerge, and the ICT sector was, and Waterloo was starting to develop. But life sciences was pretty well nowhere. And so I actually invited a delegation of folks to go down to RTP and see what a life sciences cluster concept would look like. And at that time it was David Lindsay, who was the principal secretary to the premier at the time, and is now, I believe he's still a deputy minister, right? He's still in the ranks there. Heather Monroe Bloom, who was vice president of research at U of T and has gone on to do other things at McGill and so on. Was the Deputy Minister of Health at the time, and Ken Knox, who was the Deputy Minister, I believe, of Economic Development, it was probably called at the time. So we took that group down to take a look at what a sector, or what a cluster would look like around life sciences, and I like to think that it led to some little nuggets that developed in Ontario over the years. But we're still a long way from where we want to be as a cluster in Ontario within the life sciences. We have a long way to go. I think we've got a lot of organizations that are focused on developing life sciences, but going back to David's talk, you know, are we really integrated? Are we really working together? Are we really networking in a way that's going to allow this sector to really develop and become one of the key economic sectors in Ontario? And as John Kelly mentioned earlier, of course, this is a very diverse sector. And as LSO, we're trying to play that role of being a unifying voice for life sciences in Ontario. But they are very diverse sectors. We have pharma, medical devices, diagnostics, agriculture, food, forestry, environment, and so on. The list goes on and on and on. But you've heard the word convergence here this morning too, and I think, you know, you're seeing more convergence within the life sciences sector, and I'm sure that's going to continue. Now, each one of these segments within life sciences, each one of them has at least one industry association. So you can imagine how many there are across the province and across the country. And, you know, they're all advocating for their issues and, you know, representing their members and their members' issues as effectively as they can, doing a great job at it. But often as we've started to dialogue across the segments in life sciences, it's apparent that there are a number of common issues that we could be working on together perhaps. So it does beg that question, would we be more successful in establishing life sciences as a real economic driver in Ontario, a real integrated cluster, if we had the associations working more closely together on certain issues? Now, other sectors have had pretty good success doing that. If you look at ICT, financial services, and so on, there's a lot of diverse segments within those sectors as well, but they've been able to present themselves with a lot more critical mass and a lot more alignment over the years, and have been very successful doing so. So we have a life sciences organizations across the province, and this sector represents a very significant opportunity for Ontario, so we're looking for ways to make sure that we can really drive forward on that. So the question this morning for the panelists is there a role for industry associations in bringing the life sciences segments together in some way to better achieve our objectives? And to help us think about that, we have our panelists from a diverse group of industry associations. We've got Alex Gill, Executive Director, Ontario Environment Industry Association, Walter Robinson, who is Vice President, Government Affairs for RX&D, the pharmaceutical sector, John Soloninka, who is President and CEO of the Health Technology Exchange, and Dennis Prouse, who is Vice President, Government Affairs, CropLife Canada. So after those introductory comments, we're going to turn it over to the panelists now, and we'll have a dialogue with them. They're going to make a few introductory comments, and then we'll have a bit of a dialogue, and we'll open it up for any questions that you have in the audience. And what I'd like to do is, as we're having a discussion, if you have any questions as we go along, please jump up and put your hand up or whatever and ask a question. I'd like to try and make it as interactive as possible. Yes, and use the mic if you can. Okay, thanks. So, Dennis, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll start. Thanks, everyone, for having me. As you know, CropLife Canada is the National Trade Association for the plant sciences companies. We have 34 members, probably best known to most folks in this room by our Big Six, though, as it were, Big Six global members: Dow, DuPont Pioneer, BASF, Bayer, Syngenta, and Monsanto. I often joke that when I'm talking to folks in Ottawa, especially folks of a certain political persuasion, I tell them, hi, I lobby on behalf of the folks who make GMOs and pesticides, and how do you like me so far? Always goes over well. We're members of CropLife International. We're represented in 91 different countries. Small history lesson, it wasn't too many years ago, and there's folks in this room who will know this better than I, that our organization was known as the Crop Protection Institute of Canada. And it was in the late 1990s that the decision was made that they would bring biotech under that roof and that we would be representative of both. That was an extremely important strategic decision, and one that's paid great dividends, because we're able to speak for the industry on both the chemistry and the biotech side, and it's worked out exceptionally well for us, because there's just so much dynamic growth there, and I couldn't imagine a scenario by which we'd be divided. And I think that probably plays a little bit to our discussion here today, that the fact that we're speaking with a more unified voice on behalf of the plant sciences sector works well for us. Just a couple very brief observations to start with, and I was speaking to my friend Walter about this at the break. We are able to be a unified voice to government. Increasingly, when governments want to consult, they want to consult the industry association. They want to make one phone call, not 20 phone calls. And if you're a company that wants to have a voice, the trade association is increasingly that vehicle in terms of a voice to government and a voice to those consultations. Another area is that I find takes up sometimes more of my day than actual lobbying is our relationship with stakeholder groups. We're constantly forming alliances. We constantly have stakeholder groups. Our Grow Canada partnership. Everybody always looks at my pin and wonders if it's a Government of Canada pin or even worse, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and no, it's not the case. This is our Grow Canada partnership, which is 11 of the major agricultural groups in Canada, and we lead that partnership. We're now forming up a partnership on biotech and on consumer confidence up and down the value chain. So forming those alliances and acting in a leadership role in those alliances is huge for us. And obviously as well, as a voice to media and a voice to key influencers, wrestling with, quite frankly, sometimes the stickier public policy scraps, and we certainly have no shortage of those. And that our member companies are more than happy to let their trade association deal with. What can we work on in common? Obviously intellectual property protection is huge to everybody in this room. What I think we've done not a stellar job of is communicating to government, communicating to influencers and the public as to the connection between IP and their quality of life and prosperity, tying that into the prosperity agenda. One of the lines, and I don't know if I stole this from Walter, or certainly heard Walter say it, is, how many countries in the world have created prosperity through weak IP laws? Well, the reality is none. But we have to put this in a perspective that government and key influencers can understand what's in it for me, where's the benefits. Our other benefits message comes on science-based regulation. Again, another key characteristic of nations that are prosperous is clear science-based regulation along with strong IP protection. But again, you tell that to the public, and unless you're talking about the clear benefits to them, you sound a little bit like Charlie Brown's teacher. Wah, wah, wah. They're not listening. You've got to paint the word pictures. And just relentlessly promoting that consumer-focused benefits message and just aiming that message at what we call the movable middle. We don't spend a whole lot of time wrestling with activists because that's not a productive use of our time. We're aiming that message at the movable middle and the people who need more information about our industry. So I think there's a ton of things that we can work on that are in common, in moving that agenda forward, and we'd love to be part of that. So there you go. Thank you.
Walter, you're next.
Good morning, everyone. Walter Robinson with RX&D, run our government affairs shop federally and provincially. Wanted to congratulate Life Sciences Ontario and thank you for the invitation. As you can see on the sign, 5 of your platinum sponsors are RX&D members. 6 if you include RX&D, although we really don't have money, we get it from our members, as Paul, when he was chair of the board, always told us, and to spend it wisely. Unlike Dennis, I'm going to try and work with the room. If anybody has Leafs tickets for this evening, I'd love to go see the game against LA, although I guess you won't be letting me sit in your senator seats next week. So I think a couple things to kick off the opening comments. We as a trade, we have 52 members. We represent the brand name, the innovative pharmaceutical industry in Canada. And one of our challenges right up front is we have this group called the Canadian Generic Pharmaceutical Association, which brings different messages to government. And if you're a government policymaker or a key influencer in the public, A, you're trying to find balance between the two, and B, if you're the public, you really don't care about the fighting, you just want safe and effective medicines for you. So that's one of our challenges internally within the pharmaceutical sector, which sometimes hinders us in broader life sciences messaging to government. Although, as we like to say, we're the innovators, they're the imitators. Everybody has a role in the patent life and post-patent life, and if government could just get that straight, we'd all be better. That's the ambitious and aspirational review. I think in the context of the broader life sciences sector, and this is not I like the opening remarks about colliding and ideas and people colliding to build collaboration. As anybody, some of my RX&D colleagues in the back will tell you, I'm always good at colliding with people and challenging different points of view. I think Dennis has set the table on some of the key things that we have in common. IP, science-based, evidence-based regulation. The other emerging theme, obviously, is access to capital. And access to ideas, if I could put those two together, access to capital and funding vehicles. It's interesting to hear our American colleagues from North Carolina and Massachusetts talk about NIH cuts and other things, but they're still eligible. They're still capable of leveraging $1 billion fund over a decade or a shorter period of time. Some of the things that in Canada we just say, and you're complaining about that? That would be fabulous if we could work with our policymakers on some of those things. But I guess it's a question of scale. Where I think we need to also go as trade associations working together is, and this is no disrespect to many people in the room over the last 10, 20 years who have laid out agendas before government, is understand that we can only put 3 or 4 asks in front of policymakers at any one time. And even if you're part of a coalition, and we've had to do it ourselves at RX&D, there are times when you're going to have to suck it up, and your asks are not going to be in that first tranche to government of the 3 things you want to do to enable a life sciences policy or different agenda, and it's fine, and then know that they're coming next time, but support on. And groups that have done this well, I can think of the Canadian Manufacturing Coalition that has done it with Canadian manufacturers and exporters. They've been going at it now, Jason Myers and the group, they've been going at it, and we're part of it. But most of the letters they write to Finance Minister Flaherty or the Trade Minister or the Prime Minister, they're very much tangential to some of the things that we want in reimbursement and better IP policy. But our window did come in the just concluded Canada-EU trade agreement. So it is about patience in terms of us working together. I know in an industry that's changing on a weekly and monthly basis, that's a tough thing to sell. But I think if we could put together some initiatives around looking at decade-long change, understanding multiple mandates of government, and then breaking down success factors and milestones into speeches from thrones and budgets and then other policy announcements to mark your progress, that would be helpful, where we could all kind of play the long game. And then as trade associations as well working together, I think the other thing we're going to have to do is be less reliant on our public policy advocacy. We're fundamentally misunderstood by governments in the health sector. You go through a health minister, CEO, so to speak, deputy minister, COO, so to speak, every 2 years almost. And it's back to re-educating. We advocate, we educate, we have to translate science and technology down into manageable kind of bites for public policy makers who have 100 issues in front of them. And the other thing to point out is that we have to also take a step back, I think, as trade associations and understand that we're taken for granted. There's no one in this room who doesn't know, and no one in public office today, federally, provincially, or municipally, with the exception of the long-serving Hazel McCallion in this city, who doesn't know a world without modern pharmaceuticals. There's no one in this room who really understands the world before genetically modified foods that we've been having for generations, and that our industries are taken for granted as economic generators and just factor endowments like our resources and like our minerals, that they're just there and we're entitled to them. And Carl mentioned the competition around the world taking small biotechs out to bio. If there's one thing we could do where we all come together in health sciences, agri-food, clean technology, is work together at bio to show local, regional, and national policymakers that Canada needs to step up, and we can work collaboratively on something like that and walk them around, not even get meetings between CEOs or boards and ministers, walk them around the trade show floor for half an hour. They can pick up trinkets and trash for their kids. There's all sorts of flash drives, there's all sorts of pens, there's a whole bunch of things you can bring back to the family. But to walk them around the floor to say, when it comes to in vitro fertilization, the state of Kentucky, one center in Lexington, is kicking Canada's butt in vitro fertilization and assisted human reproduction. Or walk them to see the floor booth of Massachusetts or North Carolina and the real estate they have devoted and the collaboration they have with government, with VC funds, with local hospitals, with local researchers, universities, formalized, established, long-standing, and then to walk them over to the Russian booth and the Korean booth and to say, these newly emerging countries, they're getting it. I think that's one of the things we could really do to open their eyes, because it's ironic, and I'll stop here. You try and meet with health ministers or economic development ministers here in Canada, you get your half hour, you get your 40 minutes, they come, they do the speak and sprint at a conference, and they're gone. When you get them down to bio, they are not distracted, they're caught up in the environment, they're caught up in that hoopla, and they can see that we can't rest on our laurels, and there's great economic and human health opportunity here across our sectors. We could kind of build a plan to do that, not only with the Ontario delegation, but with national delegations. There's a couple things where we could all find that 1 or 2 objectives to work together, and I'll have some more comments, but I think I'll leave it there for the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Walter. John?
Thanks very much. HTX, the Health Technology Exchange, represents a little bit of a different organization than some of my colleagues up here. We're not per se an industry association. We are actually an early stage medtech investment company. We have 32 projects in our portfolio, investing about $21 million on total project value of about $80 million over the last several years. And the reason we're a little different is that we're not an industry association, but we're a very, very strong advocate for industry. And we focus almost entirely on small to medium-sized early-stage med tech companies. Now, we have, in fact, one of the things we've been talking about on advocacy, we have a database that we've just soft launched now, which has about 3,000 entities in the ecosystem in Canada, of which about 1,800 are medtech companies. So we have quite a constituency, about 65% or so of those are based in Ontario. But one of the challenges is some of my colleagues here who represent international companies, in the medical technology space, MEDIC represents largely the multinational medical technology companies who have very similar challenges and goals with market access in Canada. And SMEs have a different goal. Their goal is international market access, not so much Canada. Having said that, one of our biggest problems to commercialization is Canadian market access. It's a little different than the multinationals, but it is similar. And I'd like to say, after 30 years of horrible problems that have been inadvertently killing innovation in Canada, for medtech in particular, we've got a lot of light at the end of the tunnel that we're seeing now. And I think some of the examples that we're doing very well in medtech, and I don't mean just our organization, I mean the ecosystem in medtech, are really good signs of collaboration between industry and government that can be replicated across the environment. We're a private sector company managing a contract on behalf of the Ministry of Research and Innovation in Ontario. One of the things that I get involved with a lot are discussions across industry, particularly pharma, biotech, and medtech, and seeing what are some of the similarities and differences. And certainly, as many of you know, if you compare medtech versus pharma, 3 to 7 years of development versus 10 to 15 years of product development, long patent life, critical for pharma biotech, important but less so when you've got a 12 to 18-month life cycle for a particular product in medtech. Engineering assembly versus science-based, creating and distilling new constituents of matter. So it's a very different dynamic. And we have cases of where it's very important for a local organization to be able to grow here. Even if they're sold to a multinational, they still tend to stay here and grow as opposed to being moved off to other global locations. But what is critical for those small companies is that they are able at a low cost and very quickly to be able to get market access locally or to do iterative development with healthcare providers and researchers in Canada to build a footprint of evidence, to have first in market in Canada so that when you go to other countries, they can see that you are successful in your own home country. If you're not successful in your home country, then my God, it's ridiculous. Now, one common element, if we look at common elements across the different industries, and I'm really talking pharma, biotech, and medtech as opposed to ag and others, but there are still some similarities. Regulatory review in Canada. This is I remember presenting in Brussels in 1992 on this exact topic, and this is ridiculous that I'm saying this again. Make regulatory review in Canada the world's fastest but without compromising quantity. Make heavy use of cross-licensing and exceptional review. I mean, you guys know what that's all about. My grandchildren will die before this will happen, unfortunately. However, one of the other things is, healthcare is provincial in Canada. We got 14 different healthcare systems in Canada. I was very fortunate to lead the development of something called P-CODER, or then it was called JODER, which uses science-based evidence for reimbursement decisions on drugs across the country, so that it doesn't mean it's the same reimbursement, but it means everyone uses the same yardstick. Well, we need the same kind of thing in medical devices. We need the same kind of thing across the board so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time with the delays and time frame associated with that. We need early conversations between innovators and providers as to what their highest priorities are, what they're willing to fund, and on what basis they're going to fund these things. And in addition, one of the big things we have is the lack of cross-silo business models. So if I give a hospital a new technology, which costs them $5,000 more, $10,000 more per procedure, and I save $80,000 in the community. Right now, that will not get funded because there's no basis for that. But the healthcare system is benefiting $60,000, $70,000 on that technology. We don't have a good mechanism now currently for, in fact, recognizing that value and realizing that value. And we have to get to that particular position. That's true in drugs and pharma and medtech and so on. And the good news is, and the last thing I'll leave you with, the good news is we've got some really wonderful things going on right now. One of them is Mars Excite, which ILSA is involved in, I'm involved in, and a number of others, which takes the regulatory, the reimbursement, and the healthcare technology assessment requirements that would be many, many years getting into the market and puts them all pre-market so that the technologies can be optimized before they go on the market, and once they get through the process, that there's an adoption of that technology. That's a really world-leading program. In addition, this has now bled over to the Ontario Health Innovation Council, which tries to counteract the inadvertent situation where right now we quash innovation in Ontario. The Ontario Health Innovation Council is to say, wait a minute, let's look at an alternate procurement pathway. Let's look at an alternate way of financing technologies into the market and, in fact, become an engine where the health of Canadians becomes affecting the wealth of Canadians or Ontarians, depending on where you're looking. So I think I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thank you, John. Alex.
Sure, thanks very much. The great thing about being the last person to speak is most of what you wanted to say has already been said. I'm here on behalf of the Ontario Environment Industry Association, and we represent 3,000 clean tech and environment companies across Ontario. It's a very big, very dynamic sector, about $8 billion a year in revenue, and about $1 billion a year in exports. The problem that we have, and it's a problem that's common to all of us here on the stage, and I would submit common to everybody in this audience, is that what we're doing is about what the economy is going to look like in 20 years' time. We're in a knowledge-based industry where brain power is powering what we're doing. The unfortunate thing when we interact with the political realm is brain power doesn't make a good photo op. Standing in front of a pickup truck and putting a bolt in a fender is a great photo op. I remember in the last election, the premier was showing up at announcements where he could say, we have created or protected, very nice turn of phrase, created or protected 50 jobs. And I had people in my membership phoning me and saying, we hired 50 people last month. Why the hell isn't he here doing an announcement? I said, he's not here doing an announcement because having a couple of hundred engineers in a design studio up on Steeles Avenue in Markham who are designing waste treatment facilities in Dubai and bringing tons of cash back into the country is not photo-oppable. Because a lot of what the political realm does is they make political policy by looking in the rearview mirror. We have been hewers of wood and drawers of water and workers in factories for branch plants. You know what? That's what the future looks like because they're looking in the rearview mirror. And the challenge that we have is that we have to make this new economy tangible to people. The challenge that I have, and actually it's kind of an exact opposite to my friend at Crop Life, I represent companies that are protecting the environment, which is a very cool thing, and creating a lot of jobs and wealth. So the challenge we have is everybody sees the environment as a frame of individual responsibility. I'm glad to be an environmental person. I put my stuff in the blue box. No one ever thinks, well, what happens to it after it goes in the blue box? The next time you're flying out of Pearson, I submit if you're flying out of Pearson today, they're going to de-ice your plane. Take a look at where that de-icing fluid goes. I'll tell you where it goes. It goes down the road from here to Mavis and Dundas, to a facility called Field and Chemical Technologies, great Mississauga company. They re-refine that stuff into new products. They take something that we used to barrel up and burn and turn it into reusable stuff. And that's just one example of the things we do, but try to make that tangible to a policymaker. That's a very, very difficult thing to do, and I'd submit to you it's a challenge we all have. So I'm very glad we get to come together in places like this because we often take what we do for granted because we're all kind of in the same fight. I want better regulatory conditions for environment and clean tech. I want quicker approvals for environmental technology. The companies I represent say, why would I want to develop new technology in Ontario if I can get an approval in California in a guaranteed amount of time? You know what? That's a great thing for us to aim for here in Ontario. One of the challenges we have, and I'll just leave it at this, one of the challenges we have, we often benchmark, not only in Ontario, but across this country, against our past performance. We're part of the Modernization of Approvals Roundtable with the Ministry of Environment, which is doing great work. But in their benchmarking, they will say, well, it took us 18 months on average to approve a technology last year. If we do it in 12 this year, isn't that great? I will say, yeah, that's awesome. What are they doing in Israel right now? We don't know. Singapore? Don't know. Chile? California? North Carolina? Those are the people we have to begin to benchmark against. We're in a global market, but we're still making policy that's very domestic and internally focused. And that's something I think we all have. So thanks for the opportunity to talk here today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I should use my mic, John. First of all, maybe I can start to see if there are any questions from the audience. Any questions from anyone from the audience at this point? Okay, seeing none. Maybe I can just start off. As you know, at Life Sciences Ontario, we've really tried to bridge the life sciences segments, and we do that because we believe that, you know, we can have more impact in what we're trying to do if we work together across the various segments, and that we believe that there are certain elements that are common. Maybe I can ask you to comment on that. I mean, do you see that as an opportunity for us in life sciences? Have you had experience working across some of the segments, and maybe talk about what those might have been, and what kind of success you've had in doing that? Walter, can I start with you?
Sure. I think in terms of the common themes that we started out with 5, if I want to stick to my own messaging and exhortation to the audience, then I think we found 2 that we have fundamental agreement on across these 4 groups. One is regulatory renewal, modernization, and the good thing is every government of every political stripe, when they come in, it's a red tape review commission, agencies, boards, commissions, reviews, whatever it is. We've got the feds working on RCC with the Obama administration, so there are windows there. I think some of our messaging we've got to get a little smarter at. To use our hockey analogy, we need to make it a shame and an embarrassment. And I spent almost a decade at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and we knew that shame and embarrassment moved a Liberal government to cut taxes and reduce, reindex the tax system to inflation. So I think it can work, and I don't say that in the context of that they don't want to do the right thing, but governments only move to certain pressures. So one of them is to say, on this regulatory side, federally and provincially, we're like a hockey team. We're a team of goalies. Like we're not scoring. So we need to kind of put that out in the public mindset for them. The other area where I think we can cooperate around here is the different things that we've heard about are strategic procurement. All of us want to get our technologies reimbursed, adopted, funded, promoted, whatever sector you're through, and that kind of all fits within the strategic procurement umbrella. And where this has worked for us just recently was on intellectual property improvements in the Canada-EU CETA agreement. And we were seized with the issue, but we were a small sliver, a very comprehensive trade agreement that the Harper government concluded with the Europeans after 4 years. And we focused literally on one ask: harmonize with Europe. Even though there were 3 asks in that, we parceled it into 1. And we got 2 out of 3 entrenched in a trade agreement. And that was with the academic sector, with chambers of commerce, and groups like the Canadian Chamber, 3CEO John Manley's group, where the Canadian Chamber, for example, they really didn't have a lot of skin in the game. It wasn't their ask, but they had put their key issues around some more fundamental legislative things and concerns on the back burner to say, we know that in our various municipalities, whether it be Quebec, whether it be Mississauga, parts of the Lower Mainland, and all points in between, there would be big pharma companies that would benefit, but more importantly, there'd be real key small Canadian enterprises who are developing that next technology, that next innovation in pharma, who would actually benefit more on IP protection than our members would, in terms of getting that idea to a certain place where it could be bought up, commercialized, look for next stage funding to move along. So I think those 2, we have a template in Canada, EU, CETA, and it was across the board. And I think even IP, where there are fundamental differences in terms of our long life cycle versus a 12 to 18-month cycle, where you truly do have first mover advantage to market, and then you're licensing the technology around the world. If we can find on regs and strategic procurement, those would be 2 places I think we could all start. And you would have, in the context of a forthcoming federal election in 2015 and likely an election in this province next year, all parties wanting to buy into influence platform development in those 2 years after the election to see if we can get some change.
Just very quickly, and if anybody's tweeting, if you could actually quote Walter on the praise of the previous Liberal government, that would be fantastic. I'd love to get that on the record. When we the question was around collaboration, right? When we serve on the Modernization of Approvals Roundtable for the province of Ontario, you've got everybody there who shouldn't have a common cause, on the surface, I shouldn't have a lot in common with the mining industry or the forestry industry or Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters or the Chemical Industry Association or any of the other associations that represent very specific concerns in this economy. But it kind of came to us, I think, at about the second meeting. We could easily do a campaign across this entire country where you would sign up 99% of progressive companies that would say, for God's sake, get on with it. That is a rallying cry I hear across every association. We know what we need to do. The problem is we are so mired in fighting very small battles on a very, very low level. It's like we've got 4 or 5 teams on the ice, to use your hockey metaphor, but we're all playing in some corner somewhere and we're not going for the goal. So there is common cause here. The challenge is the opportunity cost for associations like ours to take our head up and say, I'm going to take my time away from representing my very specific member interest to begin to start to think about what's a coordinated campaign like this to get the economy where it needs to go. Boy, that's huge. But I'm telling you that there's enough common cause across different types of industries, you could easily eke out a completely universal agenda and move it forward. I firmly believe that.
Dennis.
Well, I love talking about cooperation because, like I say, it's really everything we're about. That Grow Canada partnership I alluded to in my beginning comments, I can expand on that a little bit. It's all the major grower groups across the country, and that is, for example, the Grain Growers of Canada, the Canola Council, the canola growers, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture is in. Also, the Fertilizer Institute is in. The Soil Conservation Association. So everybody the Horticulture Council, everybody's there, and what's all their goal is to advance and defend modern agriculture. And we have enough in common with those groups, and we very much operate on that theory that it doesn't. We don't really care who gets the credit as long as our goals are being advanced. We often see when the feds are making announcements, who do they want to have on the stage? Well, typically it's Richard Phillips from the Grain Growers Association, right? Well, guess why? Because he's a farmer and he's close to the grower groups. Love that. We're totally good with that. Why? Because Richard's on board with science-based regulation and rules-based trade. So we are constantly on the lookout for people who share our goals, because we know that governments aren't dying to share a platform with us because we're just a little corporate. But they're really happy to share platforms with the grower groups and others who share our goals and aspirations. So that Grow Canada partnership, and my president and CEO, Lauren Hepworth, was really the driver behind that, has been tremendous for us. One other one that we're now, it's in its infancy, is a coalition on biotechnology. The Biotech Coalition is going to be more about, labeling is part of it. And I'm sure some folks in this room know a little bit about the frou-frou about GM labeling, but really that's just the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the iceberg underneath is consumer confidence, consumer acceptance. So we now need to do a better job than we've done in the past, partnering with people further down the value chain. And that is the food manufacturers, the food retailers. And they're the ones, we haven't talked together before. We should have, but now we're getting them to come to our conference. Now we're having them in this Biotech Coalition. How do we work together to advance the cause of consumer acceptance? You got a very skeptical public out there now. They're skeptical about everything, and we could probably spend 2 hours on why that is. But yeah, so we're long story short, we're extremely amenable to to forming coalitions and to making sure that we have other voices out there, because quite frankly, alone, we'll never be able to go achieve that. I'm struck with one thing, and an example that Walter would be familiar with. I'm always mindful of our banks and their efforts on the mergers and how badly that went in the late 90s. There is no one institute in this country that's big enough to move public policy on its own. No one. And that's always my favorite example of how that's not the case. So we've got experience on that, and we're looking to do more of it.
I think that's a great point, Dennis. I learn every day that when you're advocating for yourself, you have very little success, but when you have others advocating for you, you can move the agenda along. So something to remember. John, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I won't repeat. I agree with a lot of what has just been said, so I won't repeat it. One topic that hasn't been mentioned, but I think is a common theme, is that it's very easy to talk about photo ops. It's very easy to stand in front of a research institution or say, and that here's $30 million towards X, Y, Z research. And the belief, I think there's a sort of a mantra amongst people that research by itself is a public good, just in and of itself, and it's an end in itself. And what we've realized over the last several years is that research by itself is not an end in itself. It must be stewarded from the research, the concept, all the way through at a policy level, at a reimbursement level, and all the way through the economic development level and so on, right into use. And the structure of Canada is somewhat against that as well, with its provincial boundaries and so on. And we hear governments talk a lot about evidence. They say, oh, we want to be evidenced in our decision making and so on. Well, we have a lot of cases where there's tons of evidence about the efficacy of certain treatments, the efficacy of certain technologies, and these are in fact not being used. And mainly for political reasons or for just lack of action or lack of fire under a particular government's seat. One example, there was a joke when we were doing the PCODR, the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review process. When we were developing that, someone said, what evidence is used to determine what oncology drug a particular patient will get in Canada? Well, the piece of evidence is your postal code, because that's how the regions of the country are divided up, and whether you do or do not get funding for a particular drug. The same could be said for many other kinds of technologies. Now that we have PCODR, which has a common body of evidence that everyone is looking at, that at least uses a common basis for making decisions on the drugs. There's still political interference, but it's certainly a much better basis, and I think we can move forward, again, reducing time and effort and energy across the different regions by making common decisions. And when you do this, you're promoting Canadian industry, and when you do this, you're promoting benefits not only within Canada but also for export development. And I would also say that your comment about a job, it's very obvious. A comment about a job at a manufacturing line versus one of your white-collar jobs, they're playing to the constituents. It's all they're doing is playing to the constituents. And what we have to do, which I think is extremely important, when people say the Canadian healthcare system is the best healthcare system in the whole wide world, bar none, don't get your hands off my healthcare system. There's been some very good books by Andre Picard, by Jeffrey Simpson, a number of others that have to say we have to break this mythology in the Canadian public that says we have the greatest healthcare system in the world. We have a very good healthcare system in many dimensions. It could be an awful lot better, and the politicians will not do a damn thing to change it until their constituents are asking them to. So we, I think, need to change our focus from beating up the politicians all the time to, in fact, public advocacy to say, do you really understand how things could work differently in the world? How things work differently in the world and how they could be better here, and then you'll get the politicians to move.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to explore a couple of specific issues that might be of common interest. So strategic procurement has come up a few times this morning. And as we've polled our members over the last while, obviously this is one that comes up across the life sciences organization. John, you actually on the medical devices side has had some success here. I mean, when you look at HTX, when you look at the Excite program, the Health Innovation Council, can you maybe talk a little bit about how you think that evolved and why you've gotten to the point where you have, and what could some of the other sectors do with respect to that issue? And I think knowing the pharma field, I mean, they've been pretty well unsuccessful in moving that agenda along, and I'm not quite sure about some of the other sectors.
So it hasn't been quick. Just so you know, Dr. Les Levine, who is the Chief Medical Officer of Excite, and myself, we high-fived each other back in 1992, saying, oh, we should make the healthcare system, and wouldn't it be great if we could make the healthcare system an engine for economic growth, right? You solve the problems of the healthcare system, wonderful, and you do so in a way that leverages business. So, and we talked about the concept of Excite at that time, and isn't this great? And there were not just those two, but a number of people. There have been, I think, 3 formal major initiatives to try and get Excite on the go. I can tell you in 1992 and 1994, there were just crickets. Just when you made the statement to a government audience, they did not care. They did not care at all. So it's been a perfect storm, the growth of healthcare costs, the growth of the challenges that have been faced, and some of the cost elements that they haven't been able to control, and the economic issues. So it's been a perfect storm, but this is the third time we've had to do it. Now everyone's starting to get it. One of the reasons that it's doable in medtech and it's harder in pharma is because pharma and biotech deals with constituents of matter. The joke is if I have a surgical technology that doesn't quite work for a surgeon, he can say, could you change it that way so I could use this hand rather than that hand? Or I'm exaggerating to make a point. Then the medtech company can say, sure, give me 6 months and I'll have you the new version. If you say, well, that oncology drug, it's got systemic toxicities, could you just get rid of those systemic toxicities for me? That's kind of hard to do. So the drugs industry has a different set of arrows in its quiver that it has to use, that has to do with outcome-based financing, targeting, risk-based payments and things of this nature, which traditionally the pharma industry has not been, that's not a door you want to open too quickly, right? But I think that's one of the reasons why it perhaps has happened first in medtech, because medtech tends to be very much a working with providers optimization kind of exercise, as opposed to a constituents of matter exercise that pharma is lumped with. But I think there are still opportunities in terms of protocols, in terms of risk-based pricing, in terms of a number of different companion technologies, that I think the drug companies could do exactly the same thing. They could do exactly the same thing if they're targeting the cross-silo benefit model, if they're targeting the shared government-industry collaboration on how to maximize value and maximize revenue for the companies, but doing so by maximizing benefit.
Walter, do you have any thoughts on that?
I need to take off my RX&D hat because I don't have an official board position on risk-sharing agreements or anything like that. But to put on my personal policy wonk hat, I was struck by that in your remarks earlier in terms of putting the HTA and the financing and that discussion with regulators and payers for this technology beforehand. So when the product comes to market, everybody has that certainty of what the environment will be, how it will be used, how it will be deployed, what the budget impact is for government, what the commercial opportunity is for a manufacturer or developer of a technology. One of the challenges we have in our world is that we're moving more and more to post-market surveillance, and the safety profile of medication changes once you know about various adverse reactions, for example. We're starting to see, P-Coder has done, and thank you for your leadership work on developing P-Coder, has tried to find a place in therapy versus the traditional CDR model, questioning whether your drug ever deserves a place in therapy, or the therapy ever deserves a place. What we're doing there is we're seeing more of that kind of coverage with evidence development, risk sharing, hard budget caps, and even innovative companies saying to governments, more so in Europe, partly because they've been forced to. We have these so-called framework agreements of market certainty or predictability in the United Kingdom. PPRS has been around for 50 years. Where they're so-called voluntary, but you're either in or you're out. So we're getting there in terms of that discussion. And the last point is there is something called the Green Park Collaborative, where HTA agencies and manufacturers are thinking about global clinical trial design. What are the endpoints, the clinical endpoints you need? And in a rare disease, what are your surrogate markers? What do you need? And then as well as we're moving to drugs for rare diseases, good collaboration in that space where we can actually get to strategic procurement and reimbursement, because we're figuring out that in a rare disease you may not have 12,000 patients on the planet to run a global clinical trial in something. So there's some work happening there. Then the other fundamental policy challenge is some of this stuff, again, comes back to my first point. Some of these evolutions are generational or a decade long from getting from one to the other place. And you're going through 2, 3, and 4 governments that are focused on the transactional, the photo op, and at the point that I didn't make, there's going to have to be some point in time, and Alan O'Dette, I know, is speaking this afternoon from the Ontario Chamber. He's going to come, I'm sure, and talk about the Jobs and Prosperity Council and how that was truly a collaborative effort that government drove to a good extent, working with banks and others and some of the big economic generators of this province. We're going to have to, in terms of coming back to the theme about collaboration, we've got to bring a turnkey solution to government, because we're just not, even when we take our critical mass together, we're not on the radar screen of government because they take us for granted. And our friends in the Toronto Region Board of Trade are here. I was fascinated to learn when they did their studies, what's the biggest industry in the GTA, as in most metropolitan regions, it's food services, food production, food moving, because we have to feed ourselves 3, 4, 5 times a day, depending on your appetite. And so we have to break that kind of taking all of us for granted and our innovation for granted, that it's hard work, and that if it's going to be developed here, financed here, and government financed, why don't you capitalize and get the return on it and procure it and reimburse it and buy it?
Alex, is this an important issue for your organization? And if so, have you made any progress here?
I want to do it something very tangential to this because I think it's in the spirit of the question. Just as you had said earlier, we need to break the public myth around healthcare. We need to break the public myth, especially by my colleagues on the very far right of the political spectrum, that all regulation is bad regulation. Sorry, I was pointing to my right. Unfortunately, you're to the right of me. And I'm to the left of you. Boy, that's wild. Right? I am tired of hearing people speak this as if it is a truism that everyone should accept. There is too much regulation in the world and we need less. We have seen anti-regulatory initiatives in this province and in this country that say we're going to measure the number of regulations and just drop them every year without thought as to why they're there. So the next time you're feeding meat to your kids in the evening, think about, wouldn't this be a better meal if we didn't have any regulation around meat? Great, right? So from the environment industry, we are not fans of regulation for the sake of regulation, far from it. We are fans of smart regulation that push business in a direction that we know the world economy is going and will make them more competitive. We know energy is not going to be cheap forever. We know water is not going to be cheap forever. If we can find ways to put truer cost pricing around things like that, that encourage businesses to become much more efficient in the way they use primary things like that, guess what? In 20 years' time, we're going to have an incredibly competitive sector. And people are going to be very uncomfortable with that move. But where we have introduced that in this province, and the City of Toronto is a great example, we've introduced a higher industrial pricing for water. It's actually driven down the use of water by industrial clients and saved them money. We have great case studies on that. But the initial reaction in that thing is, well, we don't want to do that because all regulation is bad regulation. So we have had some success on that, but that's something we've got to break the public myth on.
Dennis, any thoughts on that one? Is that
It's a very good point. I mean, for our industry, we rely on the fact that the Canadians can feel confident in the regulatory system. We're always praising, notwithstanding any individual difficulties we may have with CFIA and PMRA, we're always promoting that. And we need that. We know from the focus groups we've run with the public, I mean, they want to feel confidence in their food supply and confidence in the regulatory system. We praise Canada's science-based regulatory system. In fact, we constantly beseech them to do a better job of communicating what they do. But that's not something that bureaucrats are very comfortable with. They feel that's a political role. So they're just going to regulate. We would like them to talk about their regulatory system and why it's science-based and why it works. And we're having some success in fits and starts on that. But so we certainly aren't out there promoting a message that's completely anti-regulatory because we know that we would run into some stiff resistance from people on that. Do we talk about smart regulation? Yep. Do we talk about streamlined regulation? Yeah. But if we're to talk about chopping regulations, we would run into some resistance because there isn't that level of comfort yet amongst John and Jane public.
Thank you. I thought that was very smooth how you guys moved from strategic procurement into regulation. And I didn't even have to ask the question. So we have a question here.
Thank you. My name is Carol Culhane. I have a question for Alex. You're very optimistic with your mandate. And my question is, how do you reconcile the provincial mandate within the federal mandate? You mentioned the Ministry of the Environment. They walk the talk. I know they do. Their head office is about 2 blocks from where I live. And end of October, I noticed them doing something which isn't maybe consistent with environmental practices. And they have a number of tests around their building. So I wrote them a letter, asked them, well, why are you doing this? So I got a response back last week, said, thank you for this. Yep, bring it to our attention. This is how we're fixing it. So we have this Ontario mandate. At least people municipally are doing something. It's a blue box, and we're doing things provincially. I travel quite a bit with my work, and I'm often asked why Canada hasn't signed up to the Kyoto Accord. The former UK Consulate General asked me why Canada hadn't signed up to the Kyoto Accord. So how do you reconcile what you're doing provincially with a federal mandate?
That's a really good question. I'm an optimist because we've been working with the provincial government. I've been with ONEA for 8 years, and every year we get better. One of my board members walked into a meeting a couple of years ago with an ad from The Economist that said, come to Ontario, and it had all the clean tech data in it about why there is such a good environment and clean tech sector in Ontario. We're a really small association. And I got to see my board member come in and say, we're driving the messaging for the province of Ontario. I mean, that's very progressive. The challenge we have federally is that politics, and I think my colleagues would agree, is becoming increasingly digital. It's either on or it's off. I represent a collective of businesses across this province that employ 65,000 people, and it's taken me a long time to get meetings with policy advisors from the right of the spectrum because they looked at the name and said, you're an environmental NGO, we don't want to talk to you. Really, would you like to meet the person on my board who employs 4,000 people? Would you like me to add up the tax revenue that these people are paying? And I'm sorry, you're not accountable to one side of the political spectrum. We used to have politics in this country that was accountable to a broad part of the political spectrum. I'm elected by a certain portion, but I'm responsible to everybody. We've gotten away from that. And one of the challenges we have federally is I think climate change, I don't have to say climate change is happening. The most radical socialist bunch of people in the world, Lloyd's of London, says climate change is happening and we got to price it. Energy companies are now already doing shadow pricing for carbon. Exxon is not exactly a really radical organization, okay? These people are ahead of where we are federally because we have digital politics federally. And the challenge that we have, were we a federal body, we have to have people thinking about climate change not just as a threat to communities and a threat to how people live and a threat to human life. Climate change is the single biggest business opportunity the world has because we've got to do it. We have to move food around the GTA because we have to eat, absolutely. Do we have to prevent London from flooding in the next 20 years? Yes, we do. Do we have to find a way to get, once the glaciers melt in the Himalayas, we have to find a way to get people in India to use water better? That's a huge market. And when we have a federal government that says, you know, I don't know if we want to play on this thing, not only is it disgraceful on a personal point of view, and it's my own personal view, not that of my association, it's ignoring a huge opportunity for this country. So that's how I would reconcile it. We need to recast what that is. It's not about environmental NGOs arguing a moral point. It's about a huge business opportunity and a moral imperative for this country.
Thank you. Jason.
Hi, thank you. Jason Field from Life Sciences Ontario. My question to the panelists, and first of all, I want to make a comment to Alex being an optimist. I think we all have to be optimistic in industry associations, otherwise it's just banging your head against the wall. So that's how we stay sane, is through optimism. My question to the panel, we've talked about areas of commonality and collaboration. We haven't talked very much about the vehicle by which we collaborate. So I'm wondering if you could give your thoughts on that. Is it, you know, is it a body of some sort? Is it a consolidated strategy? Is it an endorsed white paper? What does this collaboration look like from a practical perspective, and how do we drive that home?
You want to take a crack at that? Who wants to go first?
Well, there's all kinds of different ways that you can do that. I mean, one of them is, you know, joint statements to government. I think that always gets government's attention when you have diverse groups who have their letterhead on a letter or on a white paper, and we've done that on any number of occasions. Now, one of the reasons why groups sometimes shy away from doing that is that getting approvals is, you know, sometimes like herding cats, and you're running across all kinds of internal politics. And now you're trying to drive that. I think it's worthwhile, you know. And as I say, I raise the issues of of science-based regulation, and intellectual property protection. There may well be others, but you know, I think you start with the easiest one, and the easiest one is a joint white paper, / joint submissions to government, on issues of commonality, and getting as many logos as you can on that letter or on that white paper.
One of the challenges is that our industries are very complex, our technologies are very complex, and politicians typically work in sound bites and work in very simple messages that can be conveyed or hidden from their constituents. And so I think that I think it's difficult for us to have complete commonality on all of our issues. We've got different structure, different things. There are, even in this discussion, though, we've identified 4 or 5 or 6 different things. And so I think what we want to do is work at the meta level, work as high as possible on certain principles. And there should be, I think it would be great to have a white paper, a position paper, say in response to the Prosperity Council, in response to other things, where we take 4, not more than 5 principles that we all sign up to, and that we can each give our own flavor to, okay, we all agree on this, and what does this mean? How can this be affected in these different industries? And if you show a politician that with the stroke of one pen in one area, you might have improved 4 different constituencies, that might be a way of going about it. But try not to get down in the weeds, because we'll even get to points where I'm disagreeing, with Walter on a particular issue because of the nature of our industries or something like that. We don't want to get down there. You want to get on those things that are common, the high-level principles.
I'd absolutely agree with that, because you need a mix of something that's big and splashy that will cut through the clutter, and then something that's very practical that politicians can buy into, that is linked to the fundamental level at the grassroots with something people understand. So you do something big and splashy is, a Canada 2020 council that says in 5 years' time we need the country to look like this. We need these policies to grow the economy in the future. And behind that, you have the associations and the companies that make up what that evolving economy is like. And then that lets us, as part of our initiatives with government, walk in and say, you know what, we've got this, and by the way, it's congruent with these principles over here that the Premier, that the Prime Minister, that whoever have already signed on to. That's kind of how you would leverage that kind of thing. But further to the other point, unfortunately, we don't get paid every day to think that big thing and move that big thing forward. We're all accountable to boards who, when we come in with the big thing, will say, I like the big thing, but what the hell have you done for these members of ours over here? So that's often the challenge we face. It'd be great if we get somebody else to fund it. That'd be great.
I'm going to take a different to use your word, Alex, a tangent on that. I don't think we want to be making our pitch to politicians. I want to end run them, because they're only going to move on public pressure, embarrassment, shame, or an opportunity, to use your word in terms of here's an opportunity. I can speak to my own personal work in 2000. It was a 3-year campaign from 97 to 2000. We worked with the Caledon Institute of Social Policy on the issue of bracket creep. They were a left-of-center organization, and the CTF was never going to be accused of being card-carrying members of the NDP. And so there was shock value, and what are those 2 disparate groups doing, pushing the same vision and same policy? And we pushed it out to say there's 1 million low-income families that have been pushed onto the tax rolls because of this policy. That was our pitch for the first year in terms of earned media, some paid media we did. Then we drove political messaging. So I think we want to paint a compelling vision of the 2 or 3 ideas. Pick up on your point. I think we're all dancing around the same idea. But again, make it a public campaign. And if I can take a look at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, they've probably spent in excess of about $100 million, I think, to change one word, tar sands to oil sands. They've taken that, whether you agree with it or not, but they've seen the opportunity. They've made their pitch to the Canadian public on hockey games. They've made their pitch on all news shows. They have not made their pitch to public policy makers as their first target at the federal or provincial level. So that's the other thing. We need to paint a vision, compelling vision, which we have on 2 or 3 or 4 things to the Canadian public. And then, to use Dennis's point, if that's the case, let the politicians pick up and run with it and say it's their idea. Every victory has 1,000 fathers and mothers. That's fine. But that's where we need to go. And the vehicle for that, I think, is joint logos, is probably public campaigning. And less policy. We've built tons of binders of policy development and stuff. It's the Ross Perot line. Plenty of studies up there in Washington. Just go dust them off and fix the problem. Same idea here in Toronto or Ottawa. Let's build a bit more of a public message, because this is an epistemology. We're talking to ourselves to a great degree, and we need to take this message to patient groups, to the supply chain, to regular Canadians, and politicians will jump on.
Okay, thank you. I think that was a great question and some good thoughts on that. We are running out of time, but I don't like to turn down questions, so maybe I can manage this. Rick, you have a question? For the
I'll
panel?
make it quick. Actually, this is a question to you, Paul. Given pharma and RX&D represents 51 companies, there's a lot of small pharma, medium-sized pharma that don't have an association. Some of these other healthcare sectors, I think, have a greater unison of voice. And given the urgent need to have a single voice with those high-level causes, is Life Science Ontario well positioned to be a leadership role, or do you see it perhaps being a coalition of different factions together?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think what we're trying to do at LSO is create these kinds of opportunities and address that issue that David spoke about this morning, which is if we're going to have a successful cluster in Ontario, it's all about linkages and collaboration and so on. And so LSO really sees itself as kind of an opportunity to bring together a single voice that can create a big tent as opposed to individual little tents, where we can advocate for and promote this sector and move it forward as a key economic sector. So, I really believe that if we were just a pharma organization, all we would be the Ontario wing of RX&D. That's not going to get us anywhere as a sector. I think when we can find the commonality, and I think the comment was made about, if we can do some white papers together where we all sign on and say, this issue is really critical to all of these subsectors, and we can move forward, I think we get a much, much better hearing. So that's what we're trying to do. And I think we really believe we can play that role. And today's an example of trying to do that and bring the organizations together. I was really hoping to get into the issue of access to capital, because I think that's one that always creates some good discussion. But we're running out of time, and I'll need to close this up. We have one other question. John, you're going to allow me to do this? Okay. One other question.
I'll be quick as well. Trevor McPherson with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and the Ontario Economic Summit. I've enjoyed the discussion about collaboration and how you can really push a common message in terms of influencing public policy and that sort of thing. But what we've been increasingly doing at the Chamber in the work we've done through the Economic Summit and going into communities is going in with the understanding that there's a place for government, sure, but it may not be entirely government that is the prime leader of what needs to happen. And just like or they may not simply have the capacity to. And I'd just like to hear some of the panelists' comments on how important is collaboration, not simply for sending a message or coming in together to influence a particular public policy, but how important is it too for industry to have skin in the game, industry to play a leadership role in the growth of the sector?
Okay, so I'm going to ask the panel if you could do a 30-second answer on this. Dennis, do you want to start? You got 30 seconds?
Well, like I say, we're increasingly, one of the reasons why we exist is that our members want us to go play that leadership role, especially on as I call them the difficult public policy issues. I mean, we've got one on the go in Ontario right now on seed treatments and bee health that we're in the middle of. So, yeah, in terms of skin in the game, absolutely. And we always say to government that we're not going to run and hide. You need us to stand up, we will stand up, and if you need to take a couple punches, we'll take a couple punches. And once they see us as a reliable stakeholder who's not going to cut and run, it tends to improve our credibility.
You were asking how Excite got started or successful recently. In fact, it was industry that was going to government and saying, how can we contribute without asking government for more money? Just how can we optimize the relationship between the medtech industry and government and healthcare, because healthcare is obviously heavily government oriented. How can we do that? And Excite was one of several initiatives that came out of that discussion. So that was not about asking government for money. It wasn't asking government for leadership, but just for almost like for permission and collaboration. So I think it's critical. I also think it's you're going to see the public dragging the healthcare system to certain reforms. And I think it's critical for us through social media, through white papers, through other things, to reach directly to the public in order to get the public demanding certain things of the government, as opposed to trying to get the government to change in a particular direction. And I think that's already shown itself to be working in a number of different cases.
Very quickly, I think your question's a good one, and I am a huge fan of policymaking that is shared between government and industry associations. The line that we have to tread very carefully is businesses are very reluctant to pay for things twice. So they give a lot of taxes to government, and I've been in situations where government says, oh, well, that's a problem, why don't you fix that? And businesses, well, wait a minute, what are we paying you for? So there's businesses will make their own policies, and my group is a good example, that benefit them, and government has to arbitrate. Government also has to have skin in the game. So I turn the question around. I'm seeing government increasingly withdraw from the public policy space, and unfortunately, that's left either the really big dollar associations or the really innovative ones that are here to make policy in the public interest. We should be very careful about that.
The short answer to your question is yes. We should all have skin in the game. And just to pick up on the previous point, I think as well, I think we're all guilty of this. To use Dennis, I'm a boxer, so if we want to take punches, we need to throw a few more. And not seek to be liked by government, but seek to be respected, because that'll drive respect in the public sphere as well. And if there's self-interest, acknowledge it and speak to it, because you think it's still in the common interest and mutual interest, and we need to sustain it. I came up with an idea, and we need to speak. We all have Twitter handles sitting on this agenda sheet. I'm going to chat with Jason offline to see if there's a small statement we could have 100 people tweet out today that would be common on this. We don't need a white paper right away, and tag it Canadian Health on policy or something, just to create at least a 30-second buzz on Twitter. It'd be better than coming out of this room with nothing in that sense, but I know there'll be more coming in terms of the delegation coming out of that, and have Carl tweeting it out of Quebec International on that handle as well, so it has a bit of a national flair as well.
Good. Well, look, thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you to the audience. I think it's been a very interesting session, and I think clearly there's an opportunity to work more closely together as we go forward on some common issues. And I'm a big believer that government doesn't lead very often, and I've told them that before, so I don't think they'd be offended by hearing that. All the work that I've been involved on innovation, we put together business and academia, and we put together recommendations, went to government. What they need to do is support this industry with good policy, and that's what if we can advocate together for that good policy, we can move this sector along. So thank you very much, and we will be we are taking notes from these sessions, so there will be some key points come out from today. So just so that you know, we are documenting some of this. So thank you very much.
So one of the things that I thought the panel might have addressed would be things to do with time. So speed of business is one. The long-term thinking of government strategies, more than just one term of government. We also have to deal with time as well. So don't go away yet, gentlemen, because I've got a little thing here for you. Our time challenge is we would like to have you back here by about 1:10. Lunches offered outside, and please visit the booths and keep tweeting. Thank you.